The storm had come without mercy, tearing across the valley as though the heavens themselves carried secrets too heavy to keep. Rain slashed against the earth, wild and untamed, drenching the wooden roofs of Redemption Valley until they shuddered beneath its force. Thunder rolled in waves that shook the sky, as if the mountains were roaring out ancient grief. And there, beneath that violent curtain of darkness, a young woman's silhouette fought against the merciless river. Abigail Reed's chestnut hair streamed like liquid fire in the stormlight, her torn blue dress clinging to her like chains. Each breath seared her lungs, each second a war between surrender and survival. The water was cold, cruel, yet it carried her dreams and her despair together, forcing her to reckon with the truth, that she had been betrayed by the very man meant to shield her. Her arms flailed against the current, a fragile figure against the wild torrent, but there was something in her eyes even then, a spark of defiance that refused to be extinguished. Memories pierced her consciousness like fleeting lanterns in the dark. Her mother's voice, gentle as a hymn, her laughter in quieter times, and the hollow echo of Sullivan's command as he hurled her into the water as though discarding a burden rather than a soul. In the cacophony of the storm, Abigail whispered her farewell to the world, believing she would dissolve into the river's depths. Yet fate, with its quiet and mysterious hand, had other plans. Through the chaos, another presence emerged. Strong hands, roughened by years of work, plunged into the torrent, closing around her wrist with a determination that defied the storm itself. That touch, unyielding, healing in its steadiness, was the first mercy she had known in years. The man who pulled her up from the abyss seemed forged from the storm, silver-streaked hair plastered to his weathered face, eyes burning with the promise that death would not have her yet. In his arms, Abigail felt the world shift. The river raged on, the night howled with fury, but her fragile heart, starved of kindness, found the faintest breath of safety. When morning came, sunlight bled across Redemption Valley, and Abigail lay in an unfamiliar bed, her fevered body weak but alive. The air here was clean, touched with the scent of wood smoke and earth, far from the suffocating reek of whiskey and tobacco in Sullivan's saloon. Outside the window stretched miles of open land, wild, untamed, healing, a place where silence was not punishment, but peace. She stirred, remembering fragments: the river, the storm, the man who had lifted her from despair. His name lingered in her thoughts even before she heard it spoken. Samuel Blackwood. A man who bore his own ghosts, who had lived years in solitude, yet whose touch had carried her back to life. The quiet inside that ranch was unlike anything she had known. For the first time, no voices demanded, no hands pressed, no orders cut into her freedom. Only the low crackle of fire, the smell of broth simmering on the stove, and the steady breath of someone who had chosen, against all logic, to save her. There is something deeply healing in the presence of another soul who expects nothing but your existence, and Abigail felt that balm seeping into her, even as her fever still lingered. She closed her eyes, not in exhaustion, but in surrender to a fragile safety she had long forgotten how to trust. Yet storms never truly end in Redemption Valley. They pause, gathering strength, returning with claws sharper than before. Abigail's rescue was not the conclusion of her suffering. It was the beginning of a story where love would test its strength against betrayal and truth would claw its way out from years of shadows. For in the depths of Samuel Blackwood's eyes lay a memory of another woman, a love once lost, and a secret Abigail had never been told. The valley, haunted by war and greed, was not ready to let her go, and neither was the man who had thrown her into the river. And so her tale begins here, at the edge of water and storm, at the fragile border between death and rebirth, a story woven of healing and heartbreak, of tenderness blooming in unlikely soil, of courage in the face of despair. It is a story meant to remind you, dear soul listening now, that even in the darkest currents, a hand may reach through the chaos, carrying you toward light. If in these words you feel a warmth stirring in your own heart, if Abigail's breath against the storm speaks to your spirit, I gently ask you to let it linger. Share your thoughts, leave a trace of your feeling in a comment. Offer your presence to this journey. Let your support, whether through a like, a kind word, or subscribing, be the quiet light that keeps stories like this alive. Because sometimes, in a world heavy with storms, even the smallest gestures of connection can be the most healing of all. And as Abigail's path unfolds, you will see how every choice, every whisper of hope, every act of courage leads her closer to a love that is not merely romantic, but redeeming. For now, rest within the rhythm of her survival. Let the rain wash gently across your imagination and follow her as her steps, trembling but determined, carry her from the riverbank into the uncertain dawn of destiny. And with that dawn, the story carries us forward, to the town that binds her fate, the man who betrayed her, and the rancher whose heart carries secrets older than she could ever dream. The current has only just begun to shift. The sun climbed reluctantly over the jagged ridges, its pale light spilling across Redemption Valley with the softness of a blessing after a night of fury. Clouds lingered like bruises against the horizon, their edges glowing as if stitched with fire. Abigail Reed stirred beneath the rough but clean quilt, her lashes trembling against her cheeks as she awoke to the quiet hush of Samuel Blackwood's ranch. For a moment she did not know where she was. Her body still carried the memory of water dragging her down, of Sullivan's voice cold and merciless, of the storm that had seemed to swallow her whole. But the warmth beneath the quilt, the scent of wood smoke, and the steady rhythm of a man moving in the other room reminded her she had been pulled back from the brink. She pushed herself upright, though her body resisted with a dull ache in her chest. The oversized shirt she wore, clearly Samuel's, hung loose upon her frame, smelling faintly of cedar and sunlight. It was strange to be clothed in something that carried no ulterior motive, no demand, no weight of another's control. The fabric rested on her skin like quiet protection. She touched her throat, feeling the lingering rasp of fever, and drew in a careful breath. Healing did not come quickly, but it had begun, and that was enough to steady her trembling heart. Through the doorway she glimpsed Samuel at the stove, his back straight, his movements deliberate. He stirred something in a cast-iron pot, the scent of broth and herbs filling the room with a comfort that made her throat tighten. He looked nothing like the men who haunted her nights at the Silver Dollar. His silver-streaked hair was tied back loosely, his shoulders broad from years of labor, his hands sure and capable. There was no hunger in his gaze when he turned to check on her, only the kind of quiet watchfulness that reminded her of stories her mother once told, of men who built, who healed, who endured. men she had thought existed only in fading memory. "You're awake," he said simply, his voice carrying the calm of one who had faced storms greater than weather. Abigail nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The knot in her throat loosened only when he crossed the room and placed a steaming cup on the table beside her. "Drink slowly," he advised, his tone warm yet firm, like a healer coaxing life back into a fragile flame. The liquid was rich with honey, a sweetness that soothed her raw lungs. She closed her eyes as the warmth spread through her chest, easing the tightness, reminding her that not all sensations must be sharp or cruel. Healing could be quiet, tender, patient. As she drank, her gaze wandered around the cabin. It was modest, but every object seemed chosen with care. Books lined one shelf, their spines worn from use. A pair of boots rested neatly by the door, polished though well-travelled. Tools hung in order, not for show, but for work. There was an air of solitude here, yes, but not of neglect. Rather, it was the solitude of a man who had learned to carry both silence and memory like companions. "Where am I?" she finally asked, her voice still hoarse. "My ranch," Samuel replied, his eyes softening. 3 miles outside town. You're safe here." The word safe struck her deeper than she expected. For years, safety had been an illusion, a promise Sullivan dangled only to tighten his control. Here, in this place, the word felt less like a lie and more like a vow. She let it settle into her bones, fragile but real. Abigail set the cup aside, folding her hands in her lap. "Why did you help me?" The question trembled on her lips, weighted with suspicion born of years of betrayal. Samuel's gaze held hers steadily. "Because you needed saving." His voice carried no embellishment, no hidden edge. "And because no one deserves to be cast aside like that." Something inside her shifted then, like a locked door creaking open. She had expected obligation, expectation, the inevitable price of another's kindness. Instead, she found a man offering nothing but a truth that rang clean and unvarnished. For a woman who had lived beneath the shadow of constant barter, her beauty, her labor, her very existence used as currency, this felt almost impossible. "Thank you," she whispered, and though the words were small, they carried the weight of her entire being. Samuel inclined his head as if he understood, and returned to his quiet work at the stove. The day unfolded slowly, as healing days do. Abigail rested near the fire, the quilt drawn around her shoulders, while Samuel moved about the ranch with a steadiness that seemed to calm even the restless wind outside. He tended the horses, chopped wood, and returned to check on her often, never hovering, never demanding, simply present. Each gesture was like a balm upon the rawness of her spirit. She had forgotten how deeply a heart could be soothed by the absence of cruelty. By afternoon, colour had returned to her cheeks, and she found herself daring to imagine a life beyond the saloon. She remembered the pouch of coins hidden beneath her floorboard, the dream of San Francisco, the seamstress shop her mother once described with blue curtains and a bell over the door. The dream still lived, fragile but unbroken, waiting for her to gather the strength to chase it. Samuel noticed her distant look as he placed a fresh log on the fire. "Thinking of leaving already?" he asked, his voice laced with gentle humor. Abigail startled, then gave a faint smile. I was thinking of what freedom might feel like." "Freedom," Samuel said softly, as though testing the word on his tongue. "It feels like breathing without chains. You'll know it when it comes." Their eyes met, and in that moment a bridge formed. Two souls scarred by the past, each longing for release, each finding in the other a reflection of what healing might mean. The firelight softened the edges of his face, and she thought she saw a sorrow there, deep and unspoken, tied somehow to her mother's memory. She wondered at it, but fatigue tugged at her, and she let her questions rest for now. As evening approached, the valley grew quiet again, the storm's memory lingering only in the damp earth and swollen river. Inside the cabin, peace settled like a blessing. Abigail lay back beneath the quilt, listening to the steady rhythm of Samuel's movements, the clink of dishes, the creak of the chair by the fire. Her body, still frail, succumbed to sleep with less resistance than before, comforted by the knowledge that, for this night at least, no one would come to claim her, no hand would strike, no voice would command, only warmth, only quiet, only the slow stitching of wounds unseen. And so she drifted into dreams where her mother's voice mingled with the sound of the river, where silver hair gleamed against stormlight, and where the promise of freedom was not a fragile fantasy, but something tangible, close enough to touch. She slept, healing, unaware that beyond the walls of that cabin, the eyes of Sullivan and Reed still searched the valley, their hunger sharpened by vengeance. Unaware, too, that Samuel carried secrets of his own, truths buried in fire and loss, truths that bound her fate to his in ways she could not yet imagine. Morning would bring its own shadows, its own reckonings. But for now, in the fragile embrace of night, Abigail knew only this: she had been saved, and in the quiet care of Samuel Blackwood, the first threads of a new life had begun to weave themselves into her heart. And in that stillness, the story pressed onward, toward revelations waiting to surface, toward choices that would test the fragile bond between rescuer and rescued, toward a love that was not born of possession, but of healing, fierce and redemptive. The current of fate had shifted, and neither she nor Samuel could yet see where it would carry them next. The storm had passed, leaving the valley washed clean, its air rich with the scent of wet pine and earth. Yet in Abigail's heart, the echoes of that night still trembled like faint ripples after a stone sinks beneath the surface. She woke with the sunlight spilling gently across her face, the quilt drawn around her, and for a fleeting moment she allowed herself to believe she had been carried into another life altogether, one untouched by Sullivan's cruelty or Reed's hunger. But memory soon returned, sharp as a shard of glass. She pressed her palm against her chest, reminding herself she was alive, not because fate was merciful, but because Samuel Blackwood's arms had pulled her from death. The cabin was quiet, save for the low crackle of the fire. Samuel was outside tending the horses, his steady movements audible through the walls. She rose carefully, her body still tender from fever, and stepped to the small window. The land stretched wide before her, raw and healing all at once. A hawk circled high above the valley. The river gleamed in the distance, its waters calmer now, as though mocking her memory of its fury. In this silence she felt something stir within her, a fragile hope, trembling yet persistent, like a wildflower daring to bloom after frost. When Samuel returned, he carried the scent of rain and soil with him. His boots were caked in mud, his shirt damp from labor, yet his presence filled the cabin with a grounded warmth that steadied her. He placed a bundle of firewood by the hearth and glanced at her, his silver-streaked hair catching the light. "You're on your feet," he observed, not with scolding, but with quiet approval. "I didn't want to sleep the day away," Abigail replied softly, though in truth she had simply longed to see the sky again. Samuel poured her a cup of tea, the steam curling like a healing breath between them. "Your strength will return," he said, "one step at a time. The body knows how to mend itself if given peace." Peace. The word lingered in her ears. It was something she had nearly forgotten existed, and now it sat here, within reach, as though this cabin were its very dwelling place. She wrapped her hands around the cup, savouring the warmth seeping into her palms, imagining it soaking deeper into her soul, where so much had grown cold. As the hours unfolded, she began to glimpse fragments of Samuel's life. The books on his shelves spoke of a man who valued learning. The scars on his hands revealed years of hardship and healing. There was a rhythm to his movements, a quiet discipline that made the air itself feel steady. He worked not for power or control as Sullivan did, but for survival, for order, for the dignity of living. And yet, beneath that calm, Abigail sensed a deeper current, an unspoken sorrow that clung to him like shadow. They shared a meal at the rough-hewn table, bread and broth, simple yet comforting. Abigail ate slowly, her body grateful for sustenance. At times she caught Samuel watching her, not with hunger, but with the gaze of a man studying a painting long thought lost, rediscovered in unexpected light. She wondered what story his eyes carried, what memory her face might have awakened in him. "Do you live here alone?" she asked gently. "For many years," he answered. "Solitude has been my companion." His voice held no bitterness, only the quiet acceptance of a man who had chosen distance to protect wounds too deep to expose. She lowered her gaze to her bowl, the warmth of the broth anchoring her. "Solitude can be healing," she murmured, "but it can also be heavy." Samuel looked at her then, really looked, as though he saw not just the woman before him, but the weight she carried, the years of silence, of survival beneath Sullivan's rule. His gaze softened, and though he did not speak, the air between them filled with an unspoken understanding. Later that afternoon, Abigail stepped outside, her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. The sky was vast, streaked with fading clouds, and the wind lifted strands of her chestnut hair as though to remind her she was part of something larger than pain. Samuel followed at a distance, watchful yet unobtrusive, letting her breathe in the open air without fear. At the edge of the field she paused. The grass bent gently in the breeze, whispering secrets of endurance. She closed her eyes, and for the first time since her mother's passing, she prayed, not with words, but with the rhythm of her heart, asking quietly for strength, for healing, for a chance to begin again. Samuel's voice broke the silence, low and steady. "The land has a way of mending what life tears apart. It doesn't hurry, it simply grows again, even after fire, even after flood." Abigail opened her eyes, meeting his. "And people, can they grow again after so much loss?" He held her gaze, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepening. "Yes," he said firmly, "but not alone." The words settled into her like balm, both frightening and comforting. She realized then that her life had been shaped by isolation, by carrying her suffering alone. Here was a man who spoke of healing as something shared, not endured in silence. She did not know yet if she could trust such hope, but a part of her longed to try. Evening came with a hush, the kind of stillness that wraps the valley in velvet. Samuel lit the lamp, its glow painting the walls in gold. Abigail sat by the fire, mending one of his shirts with thread she had found in a small box. Her stitches were uneven at first, her hands still trembling, but the act itself soothed her. Each stitch was like a promise that she could create rather than only endure, that she could mend what was torn, even if only cloth for now. Samuel watched quietly, his expression unreadable, though his eyes carried something tender she dared not name. As the fire burned low, Abigail felt exhaustion tug at her, yet she resisted, not wanting this fragile peace to end. She glanced at Samuel, who sat across from her, the lamplight gilding his features. There was strength in his posture, but also weariness, as though he too carried memories that refused to rest. "You saved me," she whispered suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. "Not just from the river." Samuel's gaze lifted, steady and sure. He did not answer, but the silence that followed was more powerful than words. It was the silence of acknowledgement, of shared recognition that something deeper than chance had bound them in that storm. Abigail turned her eyes back to the fire, the flames dancing like fragile hope, and let the warmth seep into her bones. She knew darkness still waited beyond these walls, Sullivan's wrath, Reed's vengeance, the whispers of a town that thrived on cruelty, but here, in this small cabin, she found the first taste of healing she had ever known. The night deepened, stars scattering across the sky outside, and Abigail drifted into sleep, wrapped in the quiet strength of Samuel's home. She did not yet know the truths that lay hidden in his heart, nor the shadows gathering beyond the valley. But for now, she allowed herself the rarest of gifts: rest without fear, peace without price. And as dawn prepared to rise again, their stories, bound by blood, by memory, by the fragile promise of healing, moved quietly toward a reckoning neither could yet see, but both were destined to face. The morning arrived in a hush of golden light, pouring through the thin curtains of Samuel's cabin like a quiet benediction. Abigail woke to the soft rustle of wind moving through the trees and the distant cry of a hawk circling over the valley. For a moment she lay still, listening to the heartbeat of this place, its silence, its steadiness, its healing rhythm. She had never known mornings like this, where peace was not a stolen thing, but a gift given freely by the land itself. Her lungs still ached faintly, her body carried the weight of fever's shadow, but her spirit felt as though it were finally allowed to breathe. She rose slowly, the oversized shirt slipping against her skin, and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. The cabin smelled of coffee and wood smoke, grounding her in a sense of home she had never known. Samuel was already at the table, a book open before him, his silver-streaked hair brushed back neatly. He looked up when she entered, and his eyes softened with the kind of warmth that steadies a weary heart. "You're walking easier," he remarked, his voice a low rumble touched with quiet pride. "I feel lighter," Abigail admitted, her fingers tightening around the shawl, "as though the storm washed something away that I didn't realize I was carrying." Samuel closed the book gently, studying her with that same unwavering calm that had carried her from the river. "Sometimes storms do that. They break us open, but in the breaking, they cleanse. What's left behind can grow new. The words settled into her like sunlight seeping into cold earth. She moved to the table, and he poured her a cup of coffee, dark and steaming, with a hint of cinnamon. The taste was bold, grounding, like life itself, bitter and sweet in the same breath. She savoured it slowly, feeling it warm her chest, her hands, her very spirit. The hours of the day unfolded in a rhythm unfamiliar, yet comforting. Samuel worked outdoors, mending fences and tending to the horses, while Abigail found herself sweeping the cabin, folding linens, and preparing bread with flour he had stored away. These small acts, so ordinary, became anchors for her soul. For years her labour had belonged to Sullivan, her every movement bound to the demands of men who saw her only as an ornament or a tool. Here, each gesture felt different. It was not commanded, not watched with hunger. It was hers, freely given, freely chosen. The act of kneading bread, of sweeping dust into the light, became strangely healing, as though she was stitching herself back together with each simple motion. When Samuel returned, his shirt damp with sweat, his face marked by the sun, he found Abigail at the hearth, her sleeves rolled up, flour dusting her fingers. For a moment he simply watched her, his heart caught by the sight. She turned and met his gaze, a faint flush colouring her cheeks, and he looked away, busying himself with removing his boots. Yet the warmth lingered, quiet and unspoken. Later, as they shared the bread fresh from the fire, Abigail asked softly, "Do you ever miss it? Town life? Company? The sound of voices?" Samuel shook his head, his gaze steady on the flames. Voices don't always bring peace. Sometimes they carry only noise. Out here, the silence speaks more truth than any crowd could. She nodded, understanding far too well. Yet she felt a pang of sorrow too, for she could sense the solitude wrapped around him like a second skin. He had lived years with only his memories for company, and though he bore it with quiet strength, the loneliness had etched itself into the lines of his face. She wondered what stories he carried, what ghosts haunted him. And though she longed to ask, she held her questions back, knowing some truths needed time to rise to the surface. Evening fell with a hush of lavender light, and the cabin grew warm with the glow of fire. Abigail sat at the table, sewing one of Samuel's shirts where a seam had frayed. Samuel, seated across from her, worked on a piece of harness leather, his strong hands moving with patient precision. The air between them was gentle, filled not with words, but with the quiet comfort of companionship. It felt, to Abigail, like something rare and fragile, the kind of peace one doesn't dare disturb with needless chatter. At last she looked up, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "You've given me more kindness in these days than I've known in years. I don't know how to thank you." Samuel lifted his gaze, meeting hers with that steady calm. "You don't owe me thanks, Abigail. You owe yourself healing. That's reason enough for me." Her throat tightened, and for a moment she could not reply. She bent her head over her stitching, but her hands trembled, and a single tear fell onto the fabric. It was not sorrow alone that filled her, but a mixture of grief, gratitude, and the fragile bloom of hope. Samuel said nothing more, but his presence was enough. The quiet strength of a man who would not demand, who would not betray, who would simply remain. When she finished her mending, Abigail rose and placed the folded shirt beside him. "For tomorrow," she said softly. He nodded, and though their hands did not touch, something passed between them, an unspoken vow that reached deeper than words. Night came heavy and still, the stars scattered like prayers across the dark sky. Abigail lay beneath the quilt, listening to the soft crackle of the dying fire and Samuel's steady movements as he banked the coals for morning. She closed her eyes, her heart both weary and alive in a way it had not been for so long. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps healing was possible, that perhaps love, gentle, steadfast, redemptive, might still wait for her beyond the shadows of her past. And though danger lurked in the valley, though Sullivan's wrath and Reed's hunger still prowled unseen, Abigail slept with a quiet trust she had never known. For in the silence of Samuel's cabin, she had found something worth holding on to. The promise of peace, fragile yet enduring, like the first fragile blossom after a long, merciless winter. The night deepened, carrying them both toward the truths that lay hidden beneath years of silence, toward the reckoning that neither could yet see, but which had already begun to stir. And as the fire's last ember glowed faintly in the hearth, the bond between them, unspoken yet undeniable, grew stronger, like light blooming softly in the dark, carrying them both into the uncertain dawn that waited just beyond the horizon. The wind carried the scent of pine and damp earth into the cabin as morning settled softly across the valley. Abigail stood at the window, her shawl draped loosely around her shoulders, watching the sky blush with pale gold. The land stretched wide and unbroken, as if the storm that had nearly claimed her life was nothing more than a fading memory. Yet deep within, she knew the storm still lived. It thundered in Sullivan's wrath, in Reed's shadow, in the hollow ache of years stolen. And still, here in this quiet place, something within her was learning to breathe again. Samuel moved quietly behind her, his boots brushing the wooden floor. He placed a steaming bowl of porridge on the table and said nothing more, letting silence cradle them both. Abigail turned after a moment, her eyes catching on the way his silver-streaked hair glowed in the early light, the strength of his hands resting calmly against the edge of the chair. There was steadiness in him, the kind of calm that heals not through words, but through presence. She joined him at the table, her spoon stirring absent circles in the bowl as her thoughts wandered. "I used to dream of mornings like this," she murmured, almost to herself. "A place where no one was shouting, where no one was watching me like prey. Just the sound of wind, the taste of something warm." Samuel lifted his gaze, and for a moment she saw his own memories flicker there, ghosts of battles, losses, and years of silence endured. "Dreams," he said softly, "have a way of waiting for us, sometimes longer than we think we can bear. But when they return, they feel like they were always meant to be." The words wrapped around her like balm. She ate slowly, each spoonful a reminder that survival was not enough. There could be nourishment, comfort, even healing. The air between them carried no demand, no shadow of debt, only warmth. As the day stretched on, Abigail found herself wandering the cabin, touching the spines of Samuel's books, tracing her fingers along the worn grain of the table, the smooth handle of a lantern, the soft quilt folded neatly by the bed. Each object seemed infused with care, chosen not for show, but for use, for endurance. It felt as though the walls themselves carried the quiet heartbeat of a man who had lived with loss, yet refused to let bitterness claim him. By afternoon, Samuel was working outside, mending the corral fence. Abigail, wrapped in her shawl, carried a pitcher of water to him. The sun caught the silver in his hair, and when he straightened to take the cup she offered, their fingers brushed. The contact was brief, but it sent a tremor through her, awakening something she had long buried. Not desire born of hunger or fear, but a gentler current, like a river that flows not to consume, but to sustain. She pulled her hand back quickly, her heart beating faster, though she said nothing. Samuel drank deeply, then met her gaze. "You should rest," he said. "I've done nothing but rest," she replied, her voice softer than she intended. "I need to feel useful." His eyes lingered on her, as though weighing her strength against his concern. At last he nodded. "Then walk with me," he said. "Not far, just enough to let the valley remind you that you still belong to it." And so they walked, side by side, across the field where the grasses swayed like quiet hymns. Abigail's lungs still protested, but each breath of crisp air felt like medicine. She watched the mountains in the distance, their peaks washed in pale light, and for the first time in years she felt small, not in fear, but in wonder. "Do you believe the land can heal us?" she asked after a while. Samuel glanced toward the horizon, his jaw set with thought. "The land remembers everything," he said. "Every fire, every flood, every wound cut into it, but still it grows back, still it gives. If it can endure, so can we." His words touched something raw inside her. She slowed, letting her eyes close as the breeze lifted her hair. Healing was not a sudden miracle, she realized. It was a slow returning, like grass finding its way back through charred earth. And perhaps, just perhaps, she was ready to return too. They reached a rise overlooking the river, calmer now than on that furious night. Abigail stopped, staring at the water that had nearly swallowed her. Her breath caught, her body trembling with memory. Samuel stood beside her, his presence steady as stone. He did not touch her, did not rush her, only waited. That patience was a gift greater than words. At last, she whispered, "I thought I wanted to die that night. I thought it was the only way to end it." Her voice broke, the confession raw. "But then, you pulled me back. And now, I don't know what to do with this life I didn't expect to have." Samuel's voice was gentle, low, yet firm. "Live it, one moment at a time, not for Sullivan, not for Reed, not even for me. Live it for yourself. You've carried enough chains. Let them go." Her eyes burned with unshed tears. She turned to him, and in the quiet strength of his gaze, she saw not pity, but recognition, of pain endured, of losses borne, of the long road toward healing. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe she might not walk that road alone. They returned to the cabin as dusk descended, painting the sky in shades of rose and violet. Inside, the fire glowed warmly, casting soft light across the walls. Abigail helped prepare supper, slicing bread, stirring stew, her hands steady with purpose. Samuel said little, yet his presence filled the room, steady as the fire itself. Later, when the meal was done and the quiet stretched long, Abigail found herself speaking without planning to. "My mother used to tell me stories at night," she said, her voice hushed. She said there would be a day when I could stand on my own, when I could choose a life not built by another's hands. I thought she was only comforting me. Now, I wonder if she believed it could truly happen. Samuel looked at her with an expression that carried both sorrow and something deeper, unspoken. "She believed," he said softly, "and so must you." The fire crackled, and silence settled once more, but it was a silence filled with warmth, not absence. Abigail wrapped herself in the quilt that still smelled faintly of Samuel's home, of wood smoke and earth, and lay down with a heart less heavy than the night before. As sleep claimed her, she felt not only the echo of loss, but the stirring of something new, like a melody she had once forgotten, now softly returning. Healing was not complete, but it had begun, and with it came the quiet promise of love, not loud, not sudden, but steady and enduring, like the fire that burned through the night. And as dawn waited beyond the horizon, the path before them, though shadowed with danger, began to feel like a journey worth taking, not merely to survive, but to live, not merely to endure, but to love. The days that followed unfolded like threads of quiet grace, weaving themselves into a tapestry Abigail had never thought she would touch. Morning sunlight spilled through the cabin windows, painting golden shapes upon the wooden floor. She would rise slowly, her lungs still carrying the ache of her fever, but each day stronger, each breath easier, as though her very body was answering to the rhythm of this place. Samuel's steady presence lingered in everything. The scent of fresh bread when he returned from the village mill, the sound of his boots on the porch, the way his deep voice filled the silence without breaking it. She found comfort in the small rituals they began to share. Samuel would prepare the fire at dawn while Abigail brewed tea, her hands trembling at first until the movements became more confident. She mended his shirts with careful stitches, the thread pulling not only cloth together, but some hidden part of herself, long torn. In turn, he showed her how to grind coffee beans with the old mortar stone, how to draw water from the well, how to oil the hinges of the door so the cabin breathed more quietly. These tasks, simple though they were, became holy in their way, acts of rebuilding, of reclaiming a life from the ashes of despair. One evening, the air outside was cool, scented with rain carried down from the mountains. Samuel brought out 2 chairs and placed them on the porch. Abigail followed, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, and sat beside him as the valley stretched endless before them. The sky bled into shades of rose and amber, the clouds glowing like embers fading into night. Neither spoke at first. The silence itself was healing. At last, Abigail turned to him, her voice hushed. "Do you ever think the past releases us?" Samuel's eyes lingered on the horizon. "It doesn't release," he said quietly. "It changes its shape. It becomes something we carry differently, not a chain, sometimes a lesson, sometimes a scar." She absorbed his words, the truth of them striking deep. "And if the past was nothing but pain?" "Then it becomes the soil where something better can grow," he answered. "Even scars can bloom if we let them." The words rested within her like warm embers. She drew her shawl tighter and leaned back in the chair, letting the air fill her lungs. For so long she had been afraid to breathe deeply, afraid to hope. Now, with Samuel's quiet strength beside her, each breath felt like a prayer answered. The bond between them deepened with each passing day. It was not hurried, nor was it bound by the hunger she had endured from men in the saloon. It was something else entirely, a gentle unfolding, like dawn breaking over the mountains. Samuel did not press, did not pry, but his eyes held questions she sometimes felt too fragile to answer. And yet she found herself speaking more freely than she ever had, offering fragments of her mother's laughter, of the blue dress she had once hated to wear, of the dream of San Francisco that still lingered like a light in her chest. Samuel listened with the patience of a man who knew the cost of silence. He never interrupted, never dismissed, only nodded, his gaze steady and full of something that felt like reverence. When he spoke, it was with stories of his own, of nights on the frontier where the wolves howled too close to camp, of tending to soldiers wounded beyond repair, of the quiet solace he found in the simple act of building fences and watching the seasons change. It was during one of these evenings that Abigail noticed the way the firelight carved lines of sorrow into his face, the way his eyes sometimes turned distant, as if searching for someone lost. She wondered if her presence reminded him of another life, another love, perhaps even of her mother. The thought made her heart tremble, not with jealousy, but with a strange tenderness, as though she were touching the edges of a story that belonged to them both. The nights grew colder, and Samuel placed another quilt upon her bed, its weight both practical and comforting. One morning she discovered a small bundle of herbs on the table, thyme and lavender he had gathered near the creek. "For your chest," he explained simply, "and for rest." When she steeped them in hot water, the fragrance filled the cabin with a sweetness that felt like home. The tea soothed her lungs, but more than that, it soothed the restless corners of her spirit. Healing, she realized, was not only of the body, but of the heart, and Samuel was tending to both. One late afternoon, while the valley was quiet beneath a pale sun, Abigail asked him, "Why do you live so far from town?" He paused, setting aside the harness he had been repairing. His eyes, shadowed by memory, lifted to meet hers. "Because sometimes distance is the only way to keep ghosts from following too closely." Abigail lowered her gaze, tracing the grain of the table with her fingertips. "And yet you brought one into your home." Samuel studied her in silence, then said softly, "Not a ghost, a living soul, and souls deserve more than the chains of the past." Her throat tightened, and she could not speak. Instead, she rose and moved to the window, the light catching her chestnut hair. She pressed her hand against the cool glass, staring at the valley that stretched vast and wild. Behind her, she felt Samuel's presence like a steady warmth, not touching, not demanding, simply there. And in that moment she understood. Safety was not the absence of danger, but the presence of someone who would stand against it. The days continued, each one carrying her further from the night of the storm, further from Sullivan's shadow. Yet danger had not vanished. It lingered beyond the horizon, gathering strength. Abigail knew it. Samuel knew it. And still, they built their fragile sanctuary with quiet acts of kindness, with firelight and shared silence, with healing that grew like a fragile but unyielding vine through broken stone. One evening, as the fire burned low, Samuel rose and placed a hand gently on the back of her chair. His touch did not linger, but it steadied her like the riverbank beneath rushing water. "Rest now," he said, his voice low, carrying the weight of care. "Tomorrow will come soon enough." She nodded, her eyes meeting his, and though neither spoke the words, the truth lay between them, warm and undeniable. Their lives had begun to intertwine, not out of necessity, but out of something deeper, something healing, something that felt like the first breath after drowning. Abigail lay down beneath the quilt, listening to the sound of wind outside and Samuel's quiet movements across the room. Sleep came gently, carrying her not into nightmares, but into dreams of fields open wide, of laughter unbroken, of love that did not wound, but mended. And though the valley beyond their door was still filled with shadows, within these walls she knew something rare, the promise of peace, fragile but alive. And so the night deepened, carrying them both toward revelations waiting just beyond the horizon, toward trials yet unseen, and toward a love that, though unspoken, was already blooming like light breaking slowly through the dark. The valley was bathed in autumn light, soft and golden, as though the world itself wished to heal what had been broken. Abigail moved carefully through the cabin, her breath steadier now, her body regaining the strength she had thought lost forever. Each step she took felt like a quiet victory over the darkness that had nearly consumed her. The days with Samuel had woven themselves into a rhythm both tender and unspoken. Two lives intertwined, not by command or obligation, but by the gentle pull of trust slowly blooming between them. That morning, Samuel had risen before dawn, his silhouette framed in the doorway as he prepared to ride out to check the far pasture. Abigail watched him from the table, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, and for a fleeting moment she saw in him the image of steadfastness she had longed for all her life. His presence was not demanding, not suffocating. It was steady, like the mountains that guarded the valley, and in that steadiness she found her own heart learning to rest. When he returned, the sun had climbed higher, spilling warmth into the air. Samuel dismounted, his movements deliberate, carrying with him the scent of pine and leather. Abigail met him at the porch with a cup of water, her eyes meeting his with a quiet gratitude she could not yet name. Their hands brushed as he took the cup, and in that brief contact something unspoken passed between them, a promise neither dared to voice, but both felt as surely as breath. Later they walked together along the river bank. The water was calm now, its surface catching the sky like glass. Abigail paused, her gaze fixed on the current that had once dragged her toward death. Her chest tightened, but she did not look away. Samuel stood beside her, silent, his presence strong enough to steady her trembling. "I thought the river was my ending," she whispered, "but perhaps it was only the beginning." Samuel's voice was low, filled with a warmth that carried the weight of his years. "Beginnings often look like endings when you're in the storm. What matters is what you choose when the waters let you rise again." She turned to him, her eyes luminous with unspoken pain and hope entwined. "And if I don't know how to choose?" "Then you let life choose for you," he said gently. "You breathe, you heal, you keep walking. The rest will come." His words settled into her like roots finding soil. She drew in a breath of cool air, and for the first time the river's voice did not frighten her. It sang of resilience, of survival, of futures yet unwritten. That evening the cabin glowed with firelight. Abigail prepared supper, her hands steady as she stirred the pot, the aroma of herbs filling the room. Samuel sat nearby, mending a piece of tack, his presence grounding her like the earth beneath her feet. The silence between them was not empty, it was full. of glances, of breaths, of the quiet recognition that they had found in one another a sanctuary no storm could erase. When the meal was finished, they lingered at the table, their eyes meeting across the lamplight. Abigail set her hands against the wood, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I don't know what the days ahead will bring. Sullivan, Reed, the town itself. They won't let me disappear so easily." Samuel's gaze darkened with the weight of memory, but his voice was steady. "You are not alone anymore. Whatever comes, we will face it together." The word "together" wrapped around her like a quilt against the cold. She lowered her eyes, tears threatening but not falling. Healing was not a straight path. It wove between fear and hope, between scars and softness, but in Samuel's vow she felt her steps guided. Night fell heavy and quiet, the stars sharp against the velvet sky. Abigail lay beneath the quilt, listening to the fire's last whispering embers. Sleep came slowly, carrying her into dreams not of drowning, but of standing at the edge of the valley, the wind lifting her hair, Samuel's shadow beside hers like a promise carved into the earth itself. And when morning would come again, with its fragile light spilling into the cabin, she would rise, knowing that love was no longer a distant dream, but a quiet seed, planted deep in the soil of healing, waiting for the courage of time to let it bloom. The days that followed unfolded with the hush of something fragile being born, like the first green shoots after a long winter. Abigail moved through Samuel's cabin with a steadiness she had not known before, her steps no longer burdened by fear alone, but guided by a quiet rhythm of trust. The storm that had once nearly claimed her life lingered only in memory, softened now by the warmth of the hearth, the scent of pine drifting in through the windows, and the presence of a man whose silence spoke more comfort than words ever could. Each morning began with light spilling across the valley, gilding the grasses with dew. Samuel would rise early, his frame silhouetted against the doorway as he stepped out into the wide land. Abigail often watched him from the window, her chest tightening with an ache she did not yet dare to name. There was a gentleness in the way he carried his solitude, a kind of healing patience in every gesture, whether he was mending a fence, tending the horses, or simply pausing to light his pipe on the porch while the world stretched endlessly before him. In the evenings, they shared quiet rituals that stitched their days together like threads in a tapestry. She read aloud from his books, her voice soft against the backdrop of crackling fire. He listened with eyes half-lidded, sometimes smiling faintly, as though her words carried him back to a place he had once lost. At times, he would tell her stories from his years in the war, not the battles, but the moments of humanity that lingered amid chaos, a soldier who shared his last biscuit, a song hummed softly through the night, the hand of a stranger that steadied him when grief threatened to break him. These fragments, offered sparingly, became part of their bond, proof that even in a world fractured by cruelty, tenderness had a way of enduring. One night, as the wind moaned outside and the fire burned low, Abigail found herself speaking words she had long held locked within her heart. "All my life, I was told I belonged to others, to Sullivan, to his debts, to his will. I thought I had no voice but the one they gave me, but here, with you, I feel like I am learning to speak again." Samuel looked at her across the fire, his eyes shadowed and luminous at once. "Your voice was never gone," he said softly. It was only waiting for the moment it could be heard. Don't give it back to silence now. Let it guide you. Her breath trembled, tears pricking at her eyes. She nodded, clutching the quilt around her shoulders, and in that moment she felt something uncoil within her, as though her spirit itself was breathing freely for the first time. As days turned into weeks, the bond between them grew unspoken but undeniable. She found herself reaching for small ways to give back, mending his shirts, tending the garden patch behind the cabin, learning how to split kindling beneath his watchful eye. He, in turn, made space for her healing. He never pushed, never demanded, only stood beside her like a steadfast tree rooted in storm and sunlight alike. In his presence, she discovered that love need not devour. It could shelter, it could heal, it could wait. But beyond the cabin, the valley still carried shadows. Sullivan's presence lingered in every whisper of the townsfolk, in the uneasy glance of the sheriff when he rode by. Reed's name surfaced in rumors at the saloon, his hunger for power and cruelty like a wolf prowling the outskirts of her fragile peace. Abigail knew the world had not forgotten her, nor forgiven her defiance. Yet with each passing day, her fear no longer bound her as tightly. She had begun to believe that freedom was not just a dream whispered to her mother's grave, but something she could grasp with her own trembling hands. One evening, Samuel took her to the ridge overlooking the valley. The sky was ablaze with crimson and gold, the mountains dark against the horizon. Abigail stood there, the wind lifting her hair, her eyes wide, as though she were seeing the world anew. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Samuel stood beside her, his hands resting lightly on the railing of the fence. "It is," he agreed. Then, after a pause, his voice grew quieter. "But beauty is fragile unless it is protected. The valley has endured storms, but it endures because it heals. You, Abigail, you are the same. Fragile in moments, yes, but stronger than you know. Strong enough to claim the life you dream of." She turned to him, her eyes shimmering with something she could no longer hide. "And you? Where do you stand in that dream?" For a long moment he was silent, the wind carrying the answer before he spoke. When at last his words came, they were low, steady, filled with the weight of truth. "Beside you, if you'll have me. Not as a chain, not as a master, but as someone who will walk the road with you, through storms, through sunlight, whatever comes." Her breath caught, her chest tightening, as though her heart had grown too full to contain. She lowered her gaze, tears spilling despite herself. "I don't know what tomorrow brings," she whispered, "but I know this. Tonight, here, with you, I feel like I've come home." Samuel reached for her hand then, not swiftly, not with demand, but with the patience of a man who understood how fragile healing could be. She let her fingers intertwine with his, the warmth of his palm steady against hers. They stood there as the sun dipped behind the mountains, the sky fading into indigo, and in the hush of twilight Abigail felt a peace she had never known. The road ahead would not be easy. Sullivan's vengeance and Reed's shadow still threatened, the town still whispered, the past still lingered. Yet in that moment none of it mattered. What mattered was the quiet promise blooming between them, fragile yet strong, like a candle flame that endures even in the wind. It was not merely romance, but a deeper kind of love, healing, steadfast, redemptive. As night settled across Redemption Valley, Abigail leaned into Samuel's shoulder, letting the weight of years slip from her. For the first time in her life, she felt the truth of what her mother had always whispered, that storms end, and hearts, no matter how broken, can mend. And though the world might yet test them, she knew she would not face it alone. If these words have touched your heart, if Abigail's journey of healing and quiet love has stirred something within you, let it linger. Share your thoughts in a comment, let your voice join hers. And if you wish to walk further on this path of stories, stories of hope, of romance, of finding light after darkness, please like, subscribe, and stay. For every gesture of support is a small act of healing, a reminder that even in the vast silence of the world, we are never truly alone.